Naval Air Station, Key West, Florida, July 30th, 1993. The morning heat hangs heavy over the concrete piers of Trumbo Point. Tied up to the seawall are 6 of the fastest, most heavily armed surface combatants for their size in the history of the United States Navy. The USS Pegasus, Hercules, Taurus, Aquila, Ares, and Gemini. These are not traditional patrol boats. They are Boeing-built patrol hydrofoil missile ships. They lift their 240-ton aluminum hulls entirely out of the water, flying above the waves on aerospace-grade foils at 48 knots. Powered by the same General Electric gas turbines used in commercial airliners, they pack a 76mm rapid-fire gun and 8 Harpoon anti-ship missiles. For the past decade, they have been the undisputed apex predators of the Caribbean. They hunted down cartel smuggling boats across the Florida Straits with a flawless record. If a Pegasus-Class Hydrofoil locked onto a target, the chase ended in a seizure. They never lost a pursuit. But on this summer morning, the Navy is not ordering them to sea. The Navy is shutting them down. All 6 vessels are decommissioned simultaneously. The oldest is barely 16 years old. The youngest is just 10. In maritime terms, their hulls are barely broken in, yet they are stripped of their classified electronics, drained of fuel, and prepared for the scrapyard. Their specialized maintenance bays at Key West are emptied. Their dedicated crews are dispersed across the fleet. The sudden death of the Pegasus-class was not a failure of marine engineering. It was a collision with a rigid bureaucracy. The United States spent millions to build the ultimate coastal combatant, proved it worked flawlessly in the American market, and then threw it away because it could not survive the one force heavier than an ocean storm: American blue water naval doctrine. European allies designed the concept. Boeing built the platform. But it was the American maritime system that ultimately decided its fate. Welcome to Fallen Maritime Empires, where we explore the vessels, shipyards, and technologies that tried to conquer the water, only to be crushed by the market. Subscribe as we uncover why the United States Navy built a perfect coastal machine, then threw it away. October 21st, 1967. The Mediterranean Sea. The Israeli destroyer Eilat is shattered by 4 Styx anti-ship missiles fired from an Egyptian Komar-class fast attack craft. The Egyptian vessel never even left its harbor in Port Said. The United States Navy watched the radar tracks from across the globe, and a cold realization set in. The American fleet was built for deep ocean dominance: carrier strike groups, nuclear submarines, massive cruisers. But in the narrow straits, the coastal shallows, and the contested littorals, the multi-billion-dollar American blue water empire had no reliable defense against a cheap, fast, missile-armed patrol boat. The United States lacked a dedicated coastal combatant. If the Cold War turned hot in the Baltic Sea or the Mediterranean, American carriers would be useless in the confined waters. Enter Admiral Elmo Zumwalt. In 1970, taking command as the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, D.C., Zumwalt recognized this massive blind spot in American maritime strategy. He proposed a radical restructuring of naval procurement known as the high-low mix. The Navy would continue buying expensive high-end carriers and cruisers for the deep ocean, but it would balance them with a large fleet of low-cost, highly specialized vessels to control the coastlines. Zumwalt needed a ship that was fast enough to outrun enemy torpedoes, small enough to hide in coastal radar clutter, and heavily armed enough to sink a Soviet cruiser. To keep the development costs down, the Pentagon did not want to build this platform alone. In November 1972, the United States, West Germany, and Italy signed a formal memorandum of understanding to co-develop the Patrol Hydrofoil Missile Ship, or PHM. It was intended to be the ultimate standardized NATO vessel. The strategic vision was massive, hundreds of identical hydrofoils swarming the global choke points. overwhelming Soviet targets with coordinated missile barrages. To build a ship that defied the water, the Navy bypassed the traditional American iron benders. They did not go to Bath Iron Works in Maine. They did not hand the blueprints to Ingalls Shipbuilding in Pascagoula. Traditional shipbuilders knew how to weld heavy steel plates for displacement hulls. But a hydrofoil required a completely different discipline. The Navy went to the aerospace industry. They awarded the contract to Boeing Marine Systems in Renton, Washington. Boeing was already experimenting with commercial hydrofoil ferries on the West Coast, applying the aerodynamics of their 737 passenger jets to the fluid dynamics of Puget Sound. They viewed the ocean not as a surface to float on, but as a dense atmosphere to fly through. Boeing promised the Navy a 240-ton vessel that could transition from a traditional floating hull to flying completely above the waves, driven by marinized gas turbines instead of heavy marine diesel engines. The keel for the first prototype, the USS Pegasus, PHM-1, was laid down in May 1973 in Seattle, Washington. The construction floor looked nothing like a standard American naval shipyard. There were no massive steel bulkheads rusting in the salty maritime air. Instead, workers operating in cleanroom environments riveted and welded aerospace-grade aluminum. The internal wiring looms resembled the nervous system of an airliner rather than a destroyer. The complex hydraulic systems that controlled the foils required manufacturing tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The American maritime supply chain was suddenly being asked to pivot. Instead of standard marine brass fittings and heavy steel valves, Boeing was sourcing aviation-grade fasteners, specialized titanium joints, and complex automated flight control computers just to keep a patrol boat upright. Early naval evaluators walking the aluminum decks in Seattle were mesmerized. The Pegasus was entirely unconventional, yet it carried the firepower of a ship 10 times its displacement. The primary armament was the Harpoon anti-ship missile system, packed into 8 massive canister launchers bolted to the stern. On the bow sat an Italian-designed Otto Malera 76mm rapid-fire gun. For a traditional coastal shipyard, mounting such top-heavy weaponry on a lightweight 133-foot hull would instantly capsize it. But Boeing's computerized foil system promised absolute stability, regardless of the sea state. Early naval publications and maritime trade journals heralded the Boeing PHM as the dawn of a new epoch in warfare. A small, affordable boat that could sink an entire fleet and outrun the retaliation. But even as the prototype took shape, a small crack appeared in the economic foundation of the program. Aerospace engineering was fundamentally incompatible with cheap, mass naval procurement. The cost of milling precise aluminum foils, developing custom software to read wave heights in real time, and modifying commercial jet engines to survive saltwater intake began to compound aggressively. The low-cost element of Admiral Zumwalt's high-low mix simply evaporated. By 1977, the price per hull had spiraled from an optimistic $18 million to nearly $60 million. The European allies took a hard look at the rising balance sheets. The West German Navy realized they needed a cheap patrol boat, not a waterborne fighter jet that required specialized aerospace technicians to maintain. The Italian maritime budget could not absorb the intense maintenance demands of Boeing's complex hydraulics. One by one, the international partners withdrew. Germany pulled out, opting for traditional displacement missile boats that could be serviced in standard shipyards. Italy abandoned the project entirely, turning to their own domestic boat builders for cheaper alternatives. By the late 1970s, the grand vision of a unified NATO hydrofoil fleet collapsed. The massive production lines Boeing had envisioned expanding across Washington state were suddenly reduced to a trickle. The United States Navy, which had originally intended to buy over 30 of these vessels to patrol the Mediterranean and the Pacific, slashed the production order down to just 6 hulls. The Pegasus-Class was no longer a global standard. It was a heavily compromised, highly expensive boutique squadron, stranded within a Navy that was already beginning to lose interest. The platform that was supposed to unite a global alliance was now an isolated American experiment, waiting to prove it could actually conquer the water. February 1975, the gray waters of Puget Sound off the coast of Seattle, Washington. The USS Pegasus begins its first major sea trials, and to the traditional sailors watching from the docks, the vessel is a bizarre, ungainly sight. At rest, it draws 23 feet of water, deeper than some massive frigates, because its enormous stainless steel foil struts hang rigidly beneath the hull. Operating in displacement mode, powered by two standard Mercedes-Benz diesel engines, it maneuvers through the harbor like a heavy, awkward barge. But the true test occurs when the captain orders the transition. The crew ignites the main power plant, a General Electric LM 2500 marine gas turbine. This is not a traditional ship engine. It is a marinized version of the CF6 turbofan that powers the Boeing 747 airliner, capable of generating 18,000 shaft horsepower. As the turbine winds to life, the Pegasus does not simply accelerate, it begins to climb. The thrust is not delivered by a traditional bronze propeller, but channeled into two enormous water jets built by the Aerojet Liquid Rocket Company. These pumps inhale 90,000 gallons of seawater per minute and blast it out the stern. The hull pushes through the dense resistance of the water until it reaches the critical speed of 14 knots. Then, the physics of aerodynamics overtake the fluid dynamics. The 240-ton aluminum hull lifts 5 feet into the air. The heavy bow wave vanishes, replaced by a clean, sharp rooster tail. Observers from the Naval Sea Systems Command on the Seattle shoreline witnessed an impossible contrast. Here was a fully armed naval combatant flying above the chop of the Pacific Northwest at 48 knots, offering a ride so smooth that sailors could leave coffee cups on the bridge console without spilling a drop. The stability was the true breakthrough. Traditional patrol boats, no matter how fast, were violently thrown around by heavy seas, making their radar screens unreadable and their weapons wildly inaccurate. But the Pegasus did not ride the surface of the waves. It flew beneath them. It relied on a computerized automatic control system. Solid-state gyroscopes, accelerometers, and acoustic height sensors read the wave patterns hundreds of times a second, adjusting trailing edge flaps on the submerged foils exactly like an airplane adjusting its ailerons in turbulent air. This digital stability meant the Pegasus could fire its Italian-designed Otto Malera 76mm gun, or launch its 8 massive Harpoon anti-ship missiles while flying at top speed in heavy 8-foot swells off the coast of Southern California. When the gun fired, the recoil did not capsize the lightweight vessel. The computer simply adjusted the foil flaps to absorb the shock in real time. In the context of the American maritime budget, the tactical math seemed revolutionary. A standard Spruance-class destroyer cost over $200 million, required a crew of more than 300 sailors, and was severely restricted to deep, open water. A single Pegasus-Class Hydrofoil carried the exact same anti-ship missile loadout, required a crew of only 21, and when foil-borne, drew less than 6 feet of water. It could hide behind the shallow reefs of the Florida Keys, navigate tight coastal inlets, or ambush enemy fleets in narrow choke points, striking with the firepower of a guided missile cruiser before vanishing at highway speeds. The Navy recognized the tactical genius of the design, and the distribution began. The 6 commissioned hulls, Pegasus, Hercules, Taurus, Aquila, Ares, and Gemini, were eventually organized into Hydrofoil Squadron 2, PHMRON-2. They bypassed the massive, sprawling naval stations like Naval Station Norfolk. Instead, they required specialized, dedicated infrastructure. But to achieve this aerospace perfection, Boeing had engineered a platform that was violently hostile to the American naval support system. The Pegasus was not built from thick, forgiving maritime steel. Its hull was constructed from 5,456 marine-grade aluminum alloy to save maximum weight. If a standard Navy tugboat bumped a hydrofoil too hard against a concrete pier, it did not leave a standard dent. It caused structural fractures that required specialized aerospace welding to repair. The maintenance infrastructure of a standard boatyard was immediately overwhelmed. The intricate hydraulic systems controlling the massive struts operated at 3,000 pounds per square inch. They required absolute surgical purity. A single grain of sand or a drop of salt water in the hydraulic lines could freeze the foils in place. Traditional sailors trained to maintain rugged steam turbines and heavy diesel blocks with grease and heavy wrenches were suddenly handed a delicate machine that required clean room maintenance protocols. Furthermore, the LM-2500 gas turbine was incredibly thirsty. While flying on the foils, the Pegasus burned JP-5 aviation fuel at an astronomical rate, severely limiting its unrefueled range to roughly 700 nautical miles. It was a high-performance sprinter forced into a naval system that demanded marathon runners. The Boeing engineers had successfully conquered the fluid dynamics of the ocean. They had built a machine that could outrun a torpedo and sink a capital ship. But as the final hulls left the Renton shipyard, the United States Navy realized it possessed a weapon it did not entirely know how to support. The water had accepted the flying boat. The American maritime logistics system had not yet calculated the true cost of keeping it in the air. By 1982, the grand vision of hundreds of NATO hydrofoils swarming the Baltic Sea was completely dead. The United States Navy was left with just 6 Boeing-built hulls: Pegasus, Hercules, Taurus, Aquila, Ares, and Gemini. To the Pentagon planners focused on building a massive, 600-ship blue water navy, this tiny squadron was a logistical annoyance. They could not accompany the massive nuclear aircraft carriers across the Pacific because their fuel tanks were too small. They could not endure month-long patrols in the deep ocean without constant logistical support. The Navy needed a place to hide them, a place where their short range would not be a liability, and their incredible speed could be utilized. They found it at the southernmost tip of the continental United States. In July 1982, Hydrofoil Squadron 2, officially designated PHMRON-2, was consolidated at Naval Air Station Key West in Florida. The Navy constructed a specialized $12 million support facility at Trumbo Point. It featured dedicated aviation-grade fuel lines, mobile crane units to lift the delicate aluminum hulls out of the corrosive salt water, and specialized clean rooms for the General Electric LM-2500 gas turbines. For a brief moment, it seemed the Navy had successfully quarantined its expensive mistake at the edge of the map. But the timing of their arrival collided perfectly with a massive shift in the American maritime environment. The early 1980s marked the explosion of the Caribbean drug trade. Cartels were abandoning heavy, slow-moving merchant vessels and investing in highly modified offshore racing boats. These go-fast cigarette boats, equipped with multiple high-horsepower outboard engines, could easily reach speeds of 40 to 50 knots. They launched from the Bahamas or the Yucatan Channel, loaded with bales of cocaine and marijuana, and sprinted for the Florida coast under the cover of darkness. The United States Coast Guard cutters patrolling the Florida Straits were built for endurance and heavy weather, not high-speed pursuits. A standard 210-foot Reliance-class Coast Guard cutter topped out at roughly 18 knots. The smugglers simply watched the white hulls on their radar screens and drove around them. The American maritime border was leaking massively, and traditional naval architecture had no answer to the speed of the cartels. Then the smugglers encountered the Boeing hydrofoils. The Joint Interagency Task Force began integrating the 6 Pegasus-class vessels into their counter-narcotics grid. The very characteristics that made the hydrofoil a logistical nightmare for a global carrier strike group made it the ultimate coastal interceptor. The Florida Straits, with its shallow reefs and unpredictable chop, was the perfect hunting ground. A typical intercept unfolded in the dead of night. A Coast Guard or Customs aircraft would detect a suspected go-fast boat heading toward the Miami harbor. They would relay the coordinates to a Pegasus-class vessel loitering in the darkness. The hydrofoil would initially track the target in displacement mode, its two diesel engines emitting a low, unassuming rumble. Because the hydrofoil's radar mast sat incredibly high off the water when the struts were deployed, it had an over-the-horizon sensor advantage that the low-riding smuggler boats lacked. Once the target was within range, the captain ordered the main gas turbine ignited. The 18,000 horsepower scream of the LM-2500 shattered the quiet of the ocean. In less than 60 seconds, the 240-ton warship lifted out of the water. For the smugglers, the sight was terrifying. They were accustomed to outrunning standard patrol boats that violently pitched and rolled in the heavy swells, losing speed with every wave impact. But the Pegasus did not interact with the surface. It flew above it. Even in punishing 8-foot seas off the coast of Cuba, the hydrofoil maintained a relentless, perfectly stabilized 48 knots. The 76mm Automalera gun on the bow remained locked on target, unaffected by the chaotic water below. The squadron's operational footprint expanded outward from Key West. They established forward operating tracks near Naval Station Guantanamo Bay in Cuba and Naval Station Roosevelt Roads in Puerto Rico, effectively locking down the primary transit corridors of the Caribbean. The hydrofoils worked in pairs, creating a high-speed net that stretched across the Windward Passage. This was the pinnacle of the Pegasus program. The Navy had accidentally deployed the perfect machine for the specific American crisis of the decade. The stakes were no longer about proving a theoretical NATO doctrine. The stakes were about securing the physical maritime border of the United States. If the hydrofoil could prove its absolute dominance in the Caribbean, it might force the Pentagon to rethink its obsession with slow, heavy, deep-water displacement hulls. It might actually justify the enormous aerospace maintenance costs. For the crews operating out of Trumbo Point, there was a genuine belief that they were pioneering the future of American coastal defense. And the metrics supported their optimism. The operational record of PHMRON-2 became legendary within the maritime law enforcement community. They participated in hundreds of boarding operations. In one massive bust alone, the USS Taurus intercepted a vessel carrying over 3,000 pounds of cocaine. But the very success of these high-speed intercepts was masking a brutal mechanical reality hidden beneath the aluminum decks. The vessels were winning the tactical battles, but the ocean was beginning to tear them apart. The operational tempo of PHMRON-2 accelerated relentlessly through the late 1980s. Key West was no longer a quarantine zone for an unwanted naval experiment. It was the active front line of a localized maritime war. The Boeing hydrofoils were deployed on a continuous, grueling rotation. The USS Aquila and USS Ares pushed their aerospace-grade hardware to the absolute limit, integrating directly with the Joint Interagency Task Force South. During this era, the culture of the Florida Straits was defined by raw horsepower and evasion. The cartels utilized specialized, low-profile, super go-fast boats equipped with quad outboard engines, designing them specifically to defeat standard displacement patrol vessels. They operated at night, running without navigation lights, relying on the physical limitations of American maritime infrastructure to secure their routes. But when Coast Guard tactical commanders in Miami or radar operators aboard E-2 Hawkeye surveillance planes identified a high-value target, they did not vector a standard 210-foot cutter to intercept. They called the Key West Squadron. The hydrofoils executed a tactical doctrine that had never existed in standard American naval operations. In one defining intercept, a smuggling vessel attempting to cross the Windward Passage realized it was being painted by radar. the operators pushed their throttles to maximum, reaching 40 knots over heavy Caribbean chop. A standard Navy frigate or destroyer, no matter its size or missile armament, would have been left behind in the shallows. The USS Gemini did not attempt to plow through the water. It deployed its massive stainless steel struts, ignited the LM-2500 gas turbine, and climbed out of the ocean. The transition from a wallowing, heavy boat to a stable flying platform took less than a minute. At 48 knots, the hydrofoil ran down the smugglers in a straight, brutal sprint. Its lightweight aluminum hull flew over the very waves that were physically battering the cartel boat. The Italian-designed 76mm Automalara gun remained trained flawlessly on the target, its computerized gyroscopes absorbing every variation in the sea state. Faced with a 240-ton warship bearing down on them at highway speeds, the smugglers surrendered without a single shot being fired. By the end of the decade, the 6 vessels of the Pegasus class had compiled an intercept record that defied standard maritime metrics. Working alongside Coast Guard detachments, they accounted for roughly 30% of all narcotics seized by the entire United States Navy during this period. They participated in hundreds of successful interdictions, denying the cartel's control of the vital choke points between Cuba, Haiti, and the Bahamas. The Key West Squadron became a highly visible, highly publicized symbol of American technological supremacy on the water. This was the absolute peak of the program. The stakes were clear. If the Boeing hydrofoils could maintain this level of undisputed tactical dominance, they could force the blue water admirals in the Pentagon to acknowledge the necessity of a dedicated, high-speed coastal fleet. They could prove that Zumwalt's vision of a specialized littoral force was not just a theory, but a critical requirement for American border security. But beneath the surface of this tactical triumph, a severe mechanical crisis was quietly compounding inside the Key West facilities. Boeing had designed the Pegasus as a sprint interceptor. It was supposed to fly out, engage a target, and return to a pristine maintenance bay. The interdiction war, however, demanded that these complex machines loiter in the highly corrosive, salt-heavy environment of the Caribbean for weeks at a time. The 5456 marine-grade aluminum hull was incredibly light, but it was highly susceptible to galvanic corrosion when continuously exposed to seawater alongside the heavy stainless steel foil struts. To prevent the ocean from literally dissolving the hulls, the Navy had to install and constantly monitor complex active cathodic protection systems. Furthermore, the sheer thirst of the gas turbine dictated every tactical decision. The fuel tanks held roughly 14,000 gallons of JP-5 aviation fuel. When flying at top speed, the turbine consumed fuel at a rate that limited their foil-borne endurance to a matter of hours. They required a massive, dedicated logistical tether just to stay on station. Every hour of flight time required an exponential number of hours in the specialized maintenance facilities at Trumbo Point. Navy mechanics, traditionally trained on rugged steam plants and heavy diesel blocks, were forced to operate clean rooms to service delicate hydraulic actuators and recalibrate automated flight control sensors. When a titanium joint or a computerized height sensor failed, the logistics officers could not simply order a replacement from a standard shipyard catalog. They had to source it through Boeing's aerospace supply chains, paying premium aerospace prices for every single component. The Boeing vessels were flawlessly executing the exact mission Admiral Zumwalt had envisioned. They controlled the coastal choke points. They outran the fastest targets the market could produce. But as the 1990s approached, the Key West Squadron was about to learn a brutal lesson of the American maritime system. Conquering the fluid dynamics of the ocean was only the first obstacle. The true enemy of the hydrofoil was the maintenance spreadsheet. By 1990, the geopolitical landscape of the world fractured, and the original justification for the Pegasus class evaporated. The Soviet Union collapsed. The threat of fast attack missile boats swarming the Baltic Sea or the Mediterranean choke points vanished overnight. The United States Navy suddenly found itself without a peer competitor on the open ocean. As the Cold War ended, the Pentagon faced severe budget contractions. The massive 600-ship naval expansion of the 1980s was abruptly reversed. Admirals in Washington were ordered to slash expenditures, retire older vessels, and consolidate the fleet. Every platform was audited. Every operational hour was scrutinized. And under the harsh fluorescent lights of the Pentagon accounting offices, the 6 Boeing hydrofoils stationed in Key West began to look like a glaring, indefensible luxury. To understand the collapse of the Pegasus program, one must understand the absolute rigidity of American naval doctrine. The United States Navy is, fundamentally, a blue water force. Its core metric of power is the nuclear aircraft carrier strike group. To survive in the American maritime system, a warship must be able to deploy globally, sustain itself at sea for months, and keep pace with a carrier across the deep ocean. The Boeing hydrofoils could do none of these things. Their greatest tactical advantage, their extreme speed and lightweight aerospace construction, was their fatal strategic flaw. A standard Spruance-class destroyer carried massive diesel and fuel oil tanks, giving it an unrefueled range of 6,000 nautical miles. It could cross the Atlantic, loiter in the Persian Gulf, and return, relying on standard fleet oilers. The Pegasus-class, however, was fundamentally a short-range sprinter. Its 14,000-gallon fuel capacity was a severe bottleneck. When operating hull-borne on its diesel engines, it had a respectable range, but in a combat scenario, it was required to fly. When the 18,000-horsepower General Electric LM2500 gas turbine was ignited, the hydrofoil consumed JP-5 aviation fuel at a catastrophic rate. Foil-borne at 40 knots, its maximum operational range shrank to just over 700 miles. It could not cross an ocean under its own power without constant, dedicated logistical support. If the Pentagon wanted to deploy the USS Taurus or the USS Hercules to a conflict in the Middle East or the Mediterranean, they could not simply order the vessels to sail there. The hydrofoils required a massive logistical tether. The Navy had to task specialized supply ships or risk towing the delicate aluminum hulls across heavy ocean swells, a process that risked structural damage to the submerged foil struts. The hydrofoils were effectively tethered to the Florida coastline. They were exceptional at guarding the American maritime border, but border security was the primary jurisdiction of the United States Coast Guard, not the Deepwater Navy. The Navy viewed coastal patrol as a secondary, lesser mission. The Key West Squadron was heavily armed with Harpoon missiles designed to sink Soviet cruisers, but they were spending their operating hours chasing fiberglass cigarette boats. The mission did not match the machinery, and the machinery was becoming exorbitantly expensive to maintain. Down at Trumbo Point in Key West, the physical realities of the ocean were actively fighting the aerospace engineering. The 5456 marine-grade aluminum hull was lightweight and fast, but it was highly reactive. When placed in the warm, highly conductive salt water of the Caribbean, alongside the heavy stainless steel components of the foil struts, the vessels became massive batteries. Galvanic corrosion began to eat away at the aluminum. To keep the hulls from dissolving, the Navy relied on active cathodic protection systems, running electrical currents through the metal to neutralize the corrosion. But this required constant monitoring. The standard procedure for a traditional steel patrol boat was to leave it in the water until its scheduled dry dock period. For the Pegasus class, extended exposure to the ocean was a constant structural risk. The specialized $12 million facility at Key West was equipped with a massive synchro lift, a custom marine elevator designed specifically to haul the 240-ton hydrofoils completely out of the water for routine maintenance. The Navy was essentially forced to treat the ships like aircraft, returning them to a dry hangar rather than leaving them tied to a wet concrete pier. This aerospace maintenance protocol shattered standard naval budgets. The intricate hydraulic actuators that controlled the submerged flaps required surgical precision. Traditional Navy machinists, accustomed to striking steel valves with heavy wrenches, had to be retrained to operate in clean room environments. If a single flight control sensor failed, the hydrofoil could not fly. It was reduced to a wallowing, top-heavy patrol boat. And the supply chain was isolating them. Because the Pentagon had slashed the original order from over 30 ships down to just 6, there was no economy of scale. Boeing had closed the dedicated hydrofoil production lines in Renton, Washington. When the Key West logistics officers needed a replacement titanium bolt, a customized hydraulic seal, or a specialized software component for the automated control system, they could not pull it from a standard naval supply depot in Jacksonville or Norfolk. They had to special order it. The parts were custom milled. The lead time stretched from weeks into months. The cost of a single aerospace-grade replacement part dwarfed the cost of standard marine hardware. The 6 vessels were structurally sound, tactically unmatched, and crewed by highly dedicated sailors, but they were bleeding the coastal defense budget dry. The system had accepted the hydrofoil when money was infinite and the Soviet threat was imminent. But in the quiet, cost-conscious era of the 1990s, the American maritime bureaucracy began to close in. The boats had conquered the cartel smugglers. They had not yet faced the admirals. As the 1990s progressed, the Pentagon's procurement focus shifted entirely to a new class of vessel that would come to define the modern American blue water empire: the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer. These massive, multi-billion-dollar steel ships were designed to do everything. They could hunt submarines, track incoming ballistic missiles with advanced Aegis radar, and strike inland targets with Tomahawk cruise missiles. In this new era, the United States Navy demanded multi-mission platforms. A single ship had to justify its existence by performing a dozen different roles in a carrier strike group. The Boeing hydrofoil could only do one thing. It drove incredibly fast, and it launched Harpoon missiles. It was a highly specialized single-purpose tool in a maritime market that suddenly demanded Swiss Army knives. When the Navy auditors evaluated the Key West Squadron, the financial paradox became impossible to ignore. The cost per operating hour of a 240-ton Pegasus-class vessel was staggering. Because of the aerospace-grade parts, the aviation fuel requirements, and the clean room maintenance protocols, these tiny patrol boats were consuming an outsized percentage of the surface fleet's operational budget. The squadron was essentially functioning as a boutique airline operating on the water, and the blue water admirals had never wanted an airline. There was one obvious solution to save the vessels. If the hydrofoils were the ultimate counter-narcotics interceptors, and the American border was their ideal operating environment, the Navy could simply transfer the 6 ships to the United States Coast Guard. But this transfer exposed the ultimate trap of the Zumwalt high-low mix. The Coast Guard desperately needed the 48-knot speed to catch cartel smugglers. But the Coast Guard operates on a fraction of the Department of Defense budget. Coast Guard engineers looked at the maintenance spreadsheets for the General Electric LM2500 gas turbines. They looked at the specialized welding required for the 5456 marine-grade aluminum. They calculated the JP5 fuel burn rates. The Coast Guard realized that accepting the hydrofoils would bankrupt their own maintenance districts. They required rugged, heavy steel cutters that could loiter at sea for weeks on cheap diesel fuel, not highly strung aerospace machines that required constant dry docking. The Coast Guard politely declined the transfer. They could not afford to fly Boeing's maritime fighter jet. Left without a foreign Soviet enemy and rejected by domestic law enforcement, the Pegasus-class was totally isolated. In the spring of 1993, the hammer finally fell. The post-Cold War defense drawdowns demanded immediate, massive budget cuts across the military. The Blue Water Admirals finally had their mandate to kill the coastal anomaly. The end did not come as a gradual phase-out. It was an execution. Orders were issued from Washington. Operations in the Caribbean immediately ceased. The complex logistical tether was abruptly severed. The aviation fuel lines at Trumbo Point were shut down. July 30th, 1993. All 6 Boeing hydrofoils were decommissioned on the exact same morning. The USS Pegasus was only 16 years old. The USS Gemini was barely 10. In traditional maritime lifespans, their aluminum hulls were pristine. Their turbine engines had thousands of operational hours left. But the American maritime system simply deleted them. The specialized crews were immediately disbanded and scattered across standard displacement ships in the fleet. The boats were towed out of the Key West harbor. They were stripped of their classified electronics. The Otto Melara rapid-fire guns were lifted off the bows. The massive Harpoon missile canisters were unbolted from the sterns. The sensitive automatic control system computers were pulled from the server racks, leaving the vessels blind and permanently grounded. The Navy did not put them in the reserve mothball fleet. They were too complex and too specialized to preserve. They were immediately sold for scrap. A Virginia dismantling firm purchased the hulls for a fraction of their original construction cost. Heavy torches cut through the aerospace-grade aluminum. The massive, beautifully engineered stainless steel foil struts were severed. Millions of dollars in research, fluid dynamics, and aviation integration were melted down into raw ingots. The production line was closed. The support systems were dismantled. The fleet was gone. The dock was empty. The parts supply stopped. The tools were sold. The metal was cut. The Navy abandoned the coast. They went back to the deep water. They left the shallows behind. The United States Navy did not simply lose the 6 Boeing hydrofoils. They lost the entire concept of high-speed coastal dominance. In the decades that followed the 1993 decommissioning at Key West, the strategic gap left by the Pegasus class became a glaring vulnerability. The world did not remain peaceful. The global war on terror and the rise of asymmetric maritime threats in the Persian Gulf and the South China Sea forced the Pentagon to realize, once again, that multi-billion-dollar aircraft carriers could not fight in the shallows. In the early 2000s, the Navy attempted to resurrect the ghost of Admiral Elmo Zumwalt's high-low mix. They launched the Littoral Combat Ship, or LCS, program. The mandate was identical to the original hydrofoil requirement: build a fast, affordable, specialized vessel to control the coastal choke points. But without the Boeing aerospace engineering, and without the absolute commitment to a lightweight, single-purpose platform, the LCS program became one of the most catastrophic procurement failures in modern American maritime history. The new ships were supposed to cost $220 million each. They ballooned to over $500 million. They were designed to hit 40 knots, but their massive conventional diesel and gas turbine propulsion systems suffered crippling, cascading gearbox failures. They were too large to hide in coastal radar clutter, too heavily reliant on contractor maintenance, and critically underarmed. A 3,000-ton littoral combat ship packed less anti-ship firepower than a single 240-ton Pegasus hydrofoil from 1977. The Blue Water system had rejected the hydrofoil because it was a specialized tool that cost too much to maintain. Yet 20 years later, that same system spent billions of dollars attempting to replicate its exact capabilities, only to produce a fleet of fragile, oversized displacement hulls that the Navy is currently scrambling to decommission decades ahead of schedule. The ghost of the Key West Squadron haunts the modern Pentagon. They had the perfect coastal machine, and they melted it down. Almost all of it. When the dismantling firms bought the 6 hydrofoils in 1993, the torches cut through the Pegasus, the Hercules, the Taurus, the Aquila, and the Gemini. The aerospace-grade aluminum was recycled. The General Electric LM2500 turbines were stripped and resold, but one hull escaped the Virginia scrapyards. The USS Ares, hull number PHM-5, was spared because of a single American maritime enthusiast. A former sailor who had recognized the absolute uniqueness of the Boeing aerospace platform purchased the stripped vessel in 1996. The United States Coast Guard, the very agency that had declined to adopt the hydrofoils because of their sheer complexity, found themselves escorting the Ares one last time. But it was not a high-speed pursuit in the Florida Straits. It was a slow, agonizing tow operation. The Ares was dragged away from the salt water it was designed to conquer. It was towed across the Gulf of Mexico, up the muddy current of the Mississippi River, and finally up the Missouri River. Today, it sits moored permanently in the fresh water of the Grand River near the small landlocked town of Brunswick, Missouri. It is the last surviving physical proof of the American hydrofoil empire. The vessel is preserved by the USS Ares Hydrofoil Memorial, a grassroots organization of former crew members and aerospace enthusiasts who refuse to let the naval system erase the machine they flew. If you walk the aluminum decks of the Ares today, the absolute paradox of the program is completely visible. You are standing on a warship built with the riveting techniques of a Boeing 747 airliner. The massive stainless steel foil struts remain locked in their upright displacement position. The complex hydraulic actuators that once adjusted the trailing edge flaps in fractions of a second to absorb the violent impact of the Caribbean chop are now silent, disconnected from the central flight control computers. The hydrofoil was never defeated by the physics of the water. It was defeated by the economics of the shipyard, the rigidity of naval doctrine, and the logistics of the fuel line. It was an aerospace sprinter born into a maritime culture that only valued heavy steel marathon runners. It successfully solved the specific American border crisis of the 1980s, securing the Florida coastline with an intercept record that remains unbroken. But in the American military-industrial complex, tactical perfection is irrelevant if the maintenance spreadsheet does not balance. The deepwater admirals demanded ships that could cross oceans. The Boeing hydrofoil could only conquer the coasts, so the Navy abandoned the shallows, leaving behind a technological legacy that they have never been able to replace. The dock in Key West is empty. The clean rooms at Trumbo Point are gone. The high-speed chases across the Windward Passage belong entirely to the past. And the ultimate American coastal combatant, a machine designed to fly over the ocean at 48 knots, now sits quietly in the thick brown mud of the Midwest, waiting out the decades on a silent river. Thank you for watching Fallen Maritime Empires. If you want to understand the invisible forces that build and break the machines on the water, hit subscribe. See you in the next video.